My name is Wesley Hatch, and I live on the south shore of a lake in northern Maine called Black Hollow. I've been there a little over a year now. Before that, I lived in Portland and worked as an insurance adjuster, mostly auto and some small commercial property. And before that, I was married. I'm telling you all of that up front because I want it understood that I'm not a man who goes looking for unusual things. I'm not someone who drives out to the woods to hunt for ghosts or sit in haunted houses with a recorder. I had a normal life that came apart in normal ways, and when my uncle died and left me his cabin, I went up there because it was free and because I needed somewhere quiet to sit for a while and figure out what to do with the rest of my 40s. The cabin itself isn't anything special. 2 bedrooms, 1 bath, a wood stove, a propane tank out back, and a screened porch that faces the water. The roof was new about 6 years ago. The dock is the original one my uncle built sometime in the late 70s, and it leans about 2 inches to the left because one of the support posts has been slowly losing its fight with the lake bed for as long as I can remember. There's a small aluminum boat tied up at the end of the dock, 12 feet flat bottom, with a 9.9 horsepower outboard motor that my uncle babied for 30 years and which still starts on the second pull every time. Everything I'm about to tell you happened on and around that boat, that dock, and that cabin. Black Hollow is what people up there call a kettle lake. That means it was scooped out by a glacier a long time ago and filled in with water that has nowhere to go. It's narrow and long, almost 1.5 miles from end to end, but only about 300 yards wide at the widest point. It's also deep. I've heard different numbers from different people. The state survey says it bottoms out at around 110 feet near the middle, but I've talked to a man who used to drag a depth finder behind his canoe for fun, and he said his unit lost the bottom in 2 places and came back with readings that didn't make any sense. I don't know what to do with information like that. I'm not a hydrologist. I just know the water is dark, and you can't see your hand if you put it in past your wrist. There are 2 other cabins on the lake besides mine. One belongs to a couple from Boston who come up for 2 weeks every August and otherwise leave the place shuttered. The other belongs to a man named Earl Pomeroy. Earl is somewhere between 70 and 85. I've never asked, and I don't think he'd answer, and he lives there year-round. He was friends with my uncle. He's the closest thing I have to a neighbor, and he was the first person I sat down with after I moved in. Earl told me a lot of things in those first weeks. Where to buy hardwood for the stove, which gas station in town would let you run a tab if you knew the owner, which back road to take in March when the main one washes out. He also told me, in the same plain tone he used for everything else, not to run the motor on the lake after dark. He didn't say it like a warning. He said it the way you'd tell someone not to put metal in a microwave. Just a thing you don't do. I asked him why, and he shrugged and said the lake doesn't like it. That was the whole conversation. He moved on to telling me about a place in town that sold good bread, and I let it drop because I'd been there 3 days and I didn't want to be the city guy asking my elderly neighbor to explain his folklore to me. But I asked around gently over the next few months. I got the same answer in different words from almost everyone who'd lived there longer than 10 years. You can fish the lake during the day, you can swim it, you can paddle a canoe across it at midnight if you want, but you don't run a motor after the sun goes down. Nobody could tell me where the rule came from. Nobody knew of an accident or a drowning that started it. It was just understood. Younger people laughed about it the way younger people laugh about anything their grandparents repeat too often. Older people didn't laugh. I followed the rule, not because I believed in it, but because I was new, and I didn't see the point in being the man who broke a local custom for no reason. I told myself it was probably about noise carrying across the water at night and disturbing the other cabins, even though there were only 2 other cabins, and one of them was empty 10 months a year. I told myself a lot of things that first year that weren't quite true, and that was one of them. The trip I'm going to tell you about happened on a Thursday in October, about 14 months after I moved in. The leaves were past peak. The mornings had frost on the dock. The Boston couple had closed up their place a month earlier. Earl was in town that week visiting his daughter, and he'd asked me to keep an eye on his cabin, which mostly meant walking past it once a day and making sure nobody had broken a window. That morning, I'd gone out fishing. I went out a lot in those days because there was nothing else to do and because the fishing on Black Hollow is genuinely good if you know where the drop-offs are. I'd taken the boat to the north end of the lake, where there's a small cove with a fallen tree submerged about 10 feet down. Smallmouth bass like that tree. I'd caught 3 that morning and kept one, and around 2 in the afternoon I'd pulled the boat up onto a gravel beach at the very north tip and gotten out to stretch my legs and eat the sandwich I'd packed. I leaned my fishing rod against a tree while I ate. It was an old rod that had belonged to my uncle, and the reel on it was a Mitchell 300 from probably 1970 that he'd kept in better shape than most men keep their cars. When I got back in the boat and motored home, I didn't think about the rod again until I was tying up at my own dock and reaching for it and finding it wasn't there. I stood on the dock for a minute with my hands still out, the way you do when your brain is catching up to a small disaster. Then I swore once, quietly, and looked at the sky. It was already getting low. The sun in October up there drops fast once it commits. I figured I had maybe an hour and a half of usable light, and the round trip to the north end and back was 40 minutes if I pushed the motor, which I didn't like to do because it was old. I made the calculation that anyone would make. I told myself I could go up, grab the rod, and be back at the dock before full dark. I told myself the rule about motors after sundown was a superstition, not a law, and that even if I cut it close, I'd be fine. I told myself the rod was worth it because it had been my uncle's, which was true, and because I couldn't afford to replace it, which was less true, but felt true in the moment. I untied the boat and started the motor and went back out. The trip up was uneventful. The lake at that hour is one of the prettier things I've ever seen. The water turns the color of weak tea, and the pines on the shoreline go almost black against the sky, and you can see the wake of the boat for a long time behind you because nothing else is moving the surface. I made it to the North Cove in about 20 minutes. The rod was still leaning against the tree where I'd left it. I stepped out, picked it up, checked the reel, walked back to the boat, and pushed off. I don't remember thinking anything was wrong yet. I remember being satisfied with myself, actually, the way you are when a small problem solves itself cheaply. I remember the air smelling like cold pine. I remember pulling the cord on the motor and having it start on the first try, which I took as a good sign. The sun was already down by then, not all the way down. There was still a band of orange behind the western ridge, but the lake itself was in shadow. The water had that quality it gets at dusk, where it stops reflecting the sky and starts looking like it's producing its own darkness from underneath. I noticed it. I noticed it the way you notice a change in weather, a thing to file and not act on. I twisted the throttle and started south. The first thing that was wrong was the sound. A 9.9 outboard at half throttle has a particular noise. It's not loud, but it's steady. And after a year of running that motor, I knew what it should sound like, the way you know the sound of your own car. About 5 minutes south of the cove, the noise changed. It didn't sputter. It didn't lose RPMs. It just got quieter, not by a lot. Maybe a fifth quieter than it should have been. I turned around to look at the motor, which is a thing you do reflexively, even though looking at a motor doesn't tell you anything about how it's running. The motor looked fine. The propeller was kicking up the right amount of water. The exhaust was coming out where it was supposed to. I turned back forward and adjusted my grip on the tiller, and that was when I noticed the second thing. The wake was wrong. A boat that's small leaves a V behind it that spreads out at a predictable angle. I'd watched that V 1,000 times. The wake I was leaving that night opened normally for the first 10 or 15 feet behind the boat, and then it just stopped. Past that distance, the water behind me was flat, not rough, not choppy. Flat, like the V had been absorbed. The lake was eating the wake about as fast as the boat made it. I told myself this was a trick of the light. The sun was almost gone, and the shoreline was getting hard to read, and I was probably just not seeing the wake clearly past a certain distance. That was a reasonable thing to tell myself. I told it to myself twice and kept going. The third thing I noticed, I almost didn't notice at all, which is the thing I keep coming back to when I think about that night. About halfway down the lake, there's a small island, more of a rock pile, really, that sits maybe 60 feet off the eastern shore. It's the kind of feature you use to check your bearings when you're in a small boat without instruments. You see the island, you know how far down the lake you are. I'd used it for that purpose every time I'd gone north and come back. That night, I passed the island on my left, which meant I was running down the wrong side of the lake. The cabin was on the south shore, and to get there from the north end, you stayed on the western side of the island. I'd done it dozens of times. I had not consciously chosen to go around the eastern side. I had not turned the tiller. I'd been holding a straight line south the entire time, and somewhere in the last 10 minutes the lake had moved me, or I had moved myself, onto the wrong side of a landmark I knew by heart. I corrected. I cut the throttle, swung the boat around the bottom of the island, and lined back up with the western shore, which I could just barely see now as a darker line against the rest of the dark. My hands were not steady on the tiller. I noticed that too. I was about a half mile from my dock at that point. I should have been able to see the porch light. I'd left the porch light on before I went out. I remembered turning it on because I'd been thinking ahead, planning to come home in the dusk, wanting the cabin to be easy to find. The porch light wasn't there. It wasn't off. I want to be careful about that. The porch light wasn't burned out, and it wasn't on a timer that had failed, and it wasn't blocked by a tree. I'm telling you this because in the moment I went through all those explanations one after another, and none of them held. The light was on. I'd seen it from the cove that morning when I'd looked back. Bulbs don't burn out at convenient times. Trees don't grow in front of light fixtures in the course of an afternoon. What had happened was that the south shore of the lake, as I was looking at it, did not have my cabin on it. I want you to understand, I did not have this thought in a clean form at the time. I had it as a kind of pressure behind my eyes, a wrongness in the picture, the way you sometimes know your own kitchen has been moved through by someone else, even before you can point to what they touched. I slowed the motor down to almost nothing and squinted at the shoreline and tried to find anything I recognized. The shape of the trees was wrong. The angle of the slope was wrong. There was a small inlet about where my dock should have been, but there was no dock in it, and the inlet was the wrong shape. I sat in the boat with the motor idling, and I looked at the shore for what was probably 20 seconds and felt like a long time. Then I looked behind me. The wake was gone completely. Not the V, not even the disturbance immediately behind the boat. The water around me was perfectly still, and the boat was sitting on it the way a boat sits on glass. The motor was running. I could feel it through the tiller. I could hear it, although it was quieter than it should have been, the way I'd noticed before. But the propeller wasn't making any wake at all. I made myself look at the shoreline again, slowly, from west to east. I made myself find Earl Pomeroy's cabin, which had a metal roof that caught even the smallest amount of light, and which I knew was about 300 yards east of mine. I couldn't find it. I made myself find the dead pine on the western ridge, the one that had been hit by lightning in the 80s and never fallen, and which stuck up above the rest of the canopy like a crooked finger. I couldn't find it either. The lake I was sitting on was not the lake I had left from. I'm going to tell you what I did next, and I'm going to be honest about it. I did not panic. I want to say I panicked because that would make this easier to tell, but what actually happened was that I went very still and very quiet, and I shut the motor off. I did that because I had the sudden, certain sense that the motor was the thing that had brought me here, not turning the key, not pointing the boat in the wrong direction. The sound of the motor, running on the water after dark. I shut it off, and the silence that came in afterward was not the silence of a quiet evening. It was the silence of a room where someone has just stopped talking. I sat in the boat with the motor off for what I'm guessing was about 10 minutes. The boat drifted, but not in a current. There's no current on Black Hollow because it's a kettle lake, and nothing flows in or out of it except groundwater. The boat drifted the way a boat drifts when something is moving the water underneath it very gently and very deliberately. I took the oars out from where they were stowed under the seat. I set them in the oar locks. My hands were doing this without much input from me. I think the part of my brain that handles small motor tasks understood the situation before the rest of me did. I started rowing south. Rowing a 12-foot aluminum boat is not hard, but it's not silent either. The oars knock against the locks, and the water makes a small shushing sound on the upstroke. I did it as quietly as I could. I rowed for what I estimated was the distance to my dock, and then I rowed some more. And then I rowed some more after that, and the shoreline I was approaching never resolved into anything I recognized. The trees were the wrong height. The slope met the water at the wrong angle. I could not find a single landmark. After a while, I noticed that I was rowing, but the boat was not moving forward at the speed it should have been. I am not a strong rower, but I'm not weak either, and a flat-bottom aluminum boat with one man and a fishing rod in it should make decent progress on still water. I was making maybe a quarter of the progress I should have been. The shoreline ahead of me was getting closer, but slowly, the way a thing approaches in a dream. I stopped rowing and let the boat sit. I made myself breathe slowly. I made myself think about what I knew and what I didn't know. What I knew was that I had broken the rule. I had run a motor on Black Hollow Lake after the sun had gone down, and somewhere in the 20 minutes between leaving the North Cove and arriving at the wrong shoreline, something had changed about the lake, or about me, or about both of us. I did not have a theory about what. I'm not the kind of person who makes theories about things like that, but I had a feeling, and the feeling was that I was not alone in the boat. I want to be very careful here because nothing was visible in the boat with me. The boat was 12 feet long, and I could see all of it. There was the seat I was on, the seat in front of me where my uncle's rod was lying, the small triangle of decking at the bow, and the motor at the stern. The bottom of the boat had about an inch of water in it, the way it always did, because that boat had a slow leak my uncle had never bothered to fix. There was nothing else, but the boat was sitting lower in the water than it had been on the way up. I noticed it because the inch of water I usually had at my feet had become closer to 2 inches, and the side of the boat where I rested my arm was lower against the water than I was used to. A boat sits lower when it's carrying more weight. That's a basic fact. The boat had not picked up any cargo. I was alone in it. I sat with that for a while. Then I picked up the oars and I started rowing again, not toward the shore I couldn't recognize, but east, along the length of the lake. I had decided, without quite knowing why, that I needed to find the rock pile island. The island was the only thing I'd seen since the sun went down that I was sure was real, and I wanted to put my hand on it. The rowing was easier going east. The boat moved at a more reasonable speed. I rowed for maybe 15 minutes, looking over my shoulder every few strokes, and eventually the dark shape of the island resolved itself out of the rest of the dark. I rowed up to it slowly. I shipped the oars. I reached out with one hand and put it on the rock. The rock was warm. I want to explain how wrong that was. It was a clear October night in northern Maine. The temperature was in the low 40s and dropping. The lake water around the island was probably 45 degrees. The rock should have been the temperature of the water, or the temperature of the air, or somewhere in between. It was warmer than my hand. It was the temperature of skin. I pulled my hand back. I sat in the boat next to the island for maybe a minute, and during that minute I had the very clear sensation that the island was aware of me. Not threatening, not angry, aware, the way a sleeping animal is aware of a fly that's landed on it. I picked up the oars and I rowed away from the island, and I did it slowly, because I did not want to wake anything up. I don't know how long I rowed after that. My watch had stopped, which I didn't notice until much later. The moon should have come up at some point. It had been close to full the night before, but I never saw it. I rowed in what I thought was a straight line south, and after some long stretch of time, I started to see a different shoreline, one with trees of the right height and a slope at the right angle, and I felt the first small piece of relief I'd felt since the motor had gone quiet. The dock came out of the dark first. It was leaning 2 inches to the left, the way it always did. Then the cabin behind it. Then the porch light, which was on, exactly where I'd left it. Exactly where it had not been an hour earlier when I'd looked for it from the middle of the lake. I rowed up to the dock and I tied off the boat with hands that were stiff from cold and from holding the oars too tight. I climbed out. The dock felt solid under my feet, which was the first solid thing I'd felt in a while. I stood there for a minute with my hand on a piling, and I looked at my cabin and made sure it was my cabin. The window over the kitchen sink had the small chip in the corner that I'd been meaning to repair. The porch screen had the patch where a raccoon had torn it the previous spring. It was my cabin. I looked back at the boat, and the boat was sitting at the right depth in the water again. Whatever had been making it sit lower had gotten out somewhere between the island and here, or had stopped weighing what it weighed, or had stopped being in the boat. I don't know which. I didn't check the boat. I didn't want to. I walked up the dock to the cabin, and I went inside and I locked the door, which is a thing I'd never done before in 14 months of living there. The lock worked. I tried it twice to make sure. Then I went to the kitchen and I ran hot water over my hands until they stopped shaking. And I sat at the table with the lights on, and I didn't move for a long time. It was 11:47 p.m. when I finally looked at the clock on the stove. I had left the dock to go get the rod at around 4:30 in the afternoon. The trip should have taken me an hour. I'd been gone for 7. I want to tell you that I went to bed and slept and woke up the next morning and felt better about everything. That isn't what happened. What happened is I sat at the kitchen table with the lights on until the sun came up, and I listened to my house. The cabin was not quiet that night. I want to be careful about what I mean by that, because if I tell you I heard noises, you're going to picture the wrong thing. There were no footsteps. There was no knocking. There was nothing dramatic. What there was the regular sound of a small wood frame cabin settling at night, the ticking of the stove cooling, the creak of a beam adjusting to the temperature change, the small clicks of the metal roof contracting as the air got colder. And there was something underneath all of those sounds that I had not heard before. It was the sound of the lake. My cabin sits about 40 feet from the water. On a still night, you can hear the very faint lap of small wavelets on the shore, especially if a window is open. None of my windows were open. The wood stove was running, and the cabin was sealed up. I could hear the lake anyway. I could hear it the way you can hear traffic from a freeway 2 blocks over when the wind is right. Present, low, continuous, and somehow inside the room. I sat at the table and I listened to it. And after a while I noticed that the rhythm of the lapping was matching the rhythm of my breathing. I want to describe this carefully. I did not feel that the lake was breathing in time with me. I felt that I was breathing in time with the lake, and that I had been doing it for a while without noticing, and that if I tried to break the rhythm, I wasn't sure whose rhythm I was breaking. I tested it. I held my breath. The sound of the water continued, in and out, exactly as before. I let my breath out slowly. on a count of 4, and the water did not adjust to me. I breathed in on a count of 2, and the water did not adjust to me. The water had its own rhythm. I had been matching it, not the other way around. I made myself stop listening for a while. I made coffee. I drank it. The sun came up around 6:40, and the lake outside the kitchen window looked exactly the way it should have looked. Gray, calm, ringed by pine, with a thin layer of mist coming off the surface where the cold air met the warmer water. There was no sign that anything had happened the night before. The boat was at the dock where I'd tied it. The fishing rod was where I'd left it on the bow seat. Everything was where it was supposed to be. I stood at the window for a long time. Then I made myself eat breakfast, because I knew I needed to. And then I made myself go outside and walk down to the dock, because I knew that if I didn't do it that morning, I wasn't going to do it at all. The dock looked normal. The boat looked normal. I knelt down and I looked into the water at the end of the dock, which was a thing I'd done 100 times before, because the water there was clear enough in the first foot or so that you could sometimes see minnows. The water that morning was not clear. It was the same dark tea color it had been the night before, which was wrong because that's a dusk color, and it was full daylight. I could not see the minnows. I could not see the dock pilings under the surface. I could see about 2 inches down, and then nothing. I stood up and I walked back to the cabin. Earl Pomeroy came back from his daughter's place that afternoon. I saw his truck pull up the dirt road around 3 o'clock. I waited about an hour because I didn't want to seem like I'd been waiting for him, and then I walked over to his cabin with a casserole dish I hadn't actually made anything in, but which I held anyway, because it gave me something to do with my hands. Earl was on his porch, splitting kindling with a small hatchet. He looked up when I came around the side of his cabin, and he watched me walk the last 20 feet without saying anything. And when I got to the steps, he said, "Hello, Wesley." And then he looked at my face, and he set the hatchet down. I didn't tell him everything. I told him I'd been out on the lake the night before, and that I'd gone out later than I should have, and that some things had happened on the way back that I didn't have an explanation for. I didn't tell him about the wake. I didn't tell him about the island being warm. I didn't tell him about the way the boat had been sitting lower in the water. I told him about the shoreline being wrong, because that was the part I thought he might be able to help with. Earl listened. He didn't interrupt. When I was done, he sat down on the top step of his porch, and he was quiet for a while. And then he said, "You ran the motor." I said I did. He nodded, slow, the way old men nod when something they already knew is being confirmed. Then he said, "You got back." I said I did. He looked at me. He had pale eyes, the kind that look almost colorless in certain light. He looked at me for what felt like a long time, and then he said, "You got back, but you brought it with you, didn't you?" I didn't answer him. I didn't know how. Earl looked past me at the lake, and he said, "You'll feel it for a while, probably a long while. It doesn't go away clean." He said it the way a doctor tells you about a chronic condition, not as a sentence, as a fact. I asked him what it was. Earl shook his head. He said he didn't know, and that nobody he'd ever talked to knew, and that the people who probably had known were dead 100 years ago and hadn't written it down. He said it had been there longer than the cabins. He said his father had told him about it the way his grandfather had told his father, and that the rule about motors was the only piece of it that had survived clearly. The rest of it was just a feeling people had that the lake was paying attention, and that the motor woke it up, and that the trick was not to wake it up. I asked him if there was anything I could do. He looked at me again with those pale eyes. He said, "You can stop running the motor. You can stop going on the water after dark. You can leave a window cracked at night so it can hear out instead of in." He paused. He said, "And you can stop listening for it. That's the main thing. You can hear it now, can't you?" I said, "Yes." He nodded. He said, "You can hear it because it's listening to you, and you and it are tuned to each other now, and the way to dull that down is to not listen back. Don't sit and pay attention to the lake. Don't go down to the dock at night. Don't try to figure it out. After a while, it'll fade. Not all the way, but enough. I asked him if he could hear it. Earl smiled, just a little. The first time I'd seen him smile in about a week. He said, "Son, I've been here since I was 4 years old. I hear it like you hear your own pulse. I don't notice it most days. You get used to it." He said, "The trick is, you have to live like it isn't there. The lake doesn't push. It just sits. If you don't push back, you can have a normal life right next to it." I went home. I made dinner. I went to bed early. I left the bedroom window cracked because Earl had told me to, and I lay in the dark and I listened, even though Earl had told me not to, and I could hear the lake from the bedroom now too. It was quieter in the bedroom than it had been in the kitchen, but it was there, the same low, slow rhythm, in and out. I made myself stop listening. I made myself think about other things. I thought about my ex-wife, which is something I hadn't let myself do in months. I thought about a job in Bangor that I'd been considering applying for, which would have meant moving away from the cabin. I thought about whether I was going to apply for it. I thought about a long time, and somewhere in there, I fell asleep. The first week after that night, I followed Earl's instructions exactly. I didn't go down to the dock. I didn't go out on the water. I didn't sit on the porch and look at the lake. I left a window cracked at night, even when the temperature dropped into the high 20s and the cabin lost heat through the gap. I tried not to listen. I cooked and I read and I went into town twice for groceries, and I worked on a small carpentry project, a new shelf for the kitchen that I'd been putting off for months. The lake did not get louder during that week, but it did not get quieter either. I could hear it whenever I let my attention rest. It was a thing I had to work at, not noticing. The way you have to work at not noticing a clock ticking when you're trying to sleep in an unfamiliar room. The second week was harder. I started to notice other things. The first thing I noticed was that I was waking up exactly at 3:14 in the morning every night. Not 3:13, not 3:15, always 3:14. I would wake up, look at the clock on the nightstand, see the time, and lie there for a few minutes before going back to sleep. I tried changing my bedtime. I tried having a glass of wine before bed. I tried not having a glass of wine before bed. I woke up at 3:14. The second thing I noticed was that my coffee was tasting wrong. Not bad, just wrong. I drink coffee black, the same brand I've had for years, and it had started to taste flatter than it should have, less bitter, as though something was being filtered out of it before it got to me. I changed brands. The new brand tasted the same way. I started to wonder if it was the water, and I bought a gallon of bottled water and made coffee with that, and the coffee tasted right. I switched to bottled water for everything I drank, and the food started tasting right too. I should have been more disturbed by this than I was. I think, looking back, that I was already starting to accept things that I shouldn't have been accepting. There's a way in which a strange thing becomes normal if you live with it long enough, and I was living with it. The third thing I noticed was the worst. I want to tell it carefully because it's the part I have the hardest time being sure about. About 10 days after that night on the lake, I caught myself standing at the kitchen window looking at the dock, and I had no memory of getting up and walking to the window. I had been at the kitchen table reading a book. The book was still open on the table. I'd been on page 142. I did not remember closing the book or standing or crossing the room. I was at the window. I was looking at the dock. The dock was empty. The boat was at the end of it where I'd left it. There was nothing to see. I stepped back from the window and I looked at the clock, and about 40 minutes had passed since I'd last checked the time. I went and sat back down at the table. I read the same paragraph 3 times before I could make sense of it. Then I closed the book and put it away, and I called Earl. Earl came over. He sat in my kitchen, and he listened to me describe the morning, and he didn't say anything for a while. Then, he said, "You went down to the water, didn't you?" I said no. I said I'd been at the window. He shook his head slowly. He said, "You went down to the water, Wesley. You went down and you stood on the dock and you came back up and you don't remember it." He said it kindly. He wasn't accusing me. He said it the way you tell a friend something they need to hear. I said, "How do you know?" He said, "Your boots are wet." I looked down. My boots were wet. There was a small ring of moisture on the kitchen floor around them, where the water had soaked through and was drying. I sat in the chair and I looked at my boots and I tried to remember anything between page 142 of the book and standing at the window. I could not. There was no memory there. There was no missing time feeling, the way people describe it on television. There was just a clean absence, like a piece of tape with nothing recorded on it. Earl made me coffee. He used the bottled water without asking, which meant I'd told him about the water at some point and forgotten that too, or that he'd known already. We sat at the table and drank the coffee, and he talked to me slowly about a man named Pete Lavoie, who had lived in my cabin in the early 60s. Pete had been a friend of Earl's father. Pete had run a motor on the lake one summer evening because his wife had been bitten by something out at the north end, and he was trying to get her to a doctor. He had made it home. His wife had recovered. Pete had stayed in the cabin for another 11 years after that, and Earl had known him. Earl said Pete had been a good man and a quiet one, and that toward the end, he had been quieter still. Earl said his father had told him that Pete had stopped being able to go down to the lake, not because he was afraid of it, but because he would walk down there in the evening and stand on the dock for hours without remembering it. His wife had finally moved them off the lake into town, and Pete had died about 2 years after that, of nothing in particular. He had just stopped. I asked Earl why he was telling me this. Earl said, "I'm telling you because you can't stay here, Wesley. You can stay for a while, maybe a year, maybe more, but not forever. The longer you stay, the more it learns you." Pete stayed 11 years. By the end, he wasn't much of a Pete anymore. He said it without drama. He said it the way you tell a man his roof needs to be replaced. I asked him why he had stayed, why he was still there at his age, after a lifetime on the lake. Earl smiled again. He said, "Son, I was born here. It learned me when I was 4. There's nothing left of me that isn't already some of it." He said, "You weren't born here. You came in clean. You can still leave clean, mostly, if you go soon." We finished the coffee. Earl went home. I sat at the kitchen table for a long time. That night, I packed a bag. I didn't leave that week or the next. I want to be honest about why. The cabin was paid for. I had no job lined up. The job in Bangor was something I'd been considering, but considering and committing are different things, and I'm not a man who moves fast on big decisions. I had also started to feel a quiet tug in the other direction, the kind of tug Earl had warned me about without quite naming it, which was that the cabin in some way did not want me to leave. This is the part of the story that's hardest to tell because nothing in it is dramatic. I did not see anything pulling me back. The cabin did not lock its doors when I tried to leave. There were no whispers in the walls. There was just a slow, steady, quiet sense every time I thought about loading my truck and driving south that I didn't really need to, that the cabin was nice, that winter would be coming soon and it would be peaceful here, that I had built a life of a kind and that disrupting it would be foolish. The thoughts felt like my own. That was the worst part. I could not tell where I ended and where the suggestion began. I would sit at the kitchen table thinking about Bangor, and a very reasonable internal voice would point out that the rent in Bangor would eat my savings inside a year, and that I had no friends there, and that the cabin had everything I needed, and that I was being a city person about a small bad experience. The voice was correct on every point. The voice was also not entirely mine. I made myself call my sister. I hadn't talked to her in about 4 months. I'd been avoiding her because we'd had a bad conversation around the time of the divorce, but I called her and I talked about nothing important for 45 minutes. Her kids, her job, a renovation she was doing. And at the end of the call, I said, I think I'm going to move down to Bangor in November. I said it without giving myself time to think about it. She said, "That's good, Wesley." She said, "It's good to hear you sound like that." I asked her what she meant. She said, "Like a person making a plan." I sat on the porch after the call. The lake was right there, gray and still, perfectly framed between 2 pines. I looked at it. I made myself look at it directly, which is something I had not done in weeks. I was not supposed to listen to it, but I had not been told not to look at it. And I wanted to look. I wanted to know what I was leaving. The lake looked back. I want to say that carefully. The lake did not have eyes. It did not have a face. It did not move. It looked back the way a room looks back when you know someone has been sitting in it. There was an attention in the water. It had been there the whole time, and I had been pretending it wasn't, because Earl had told me to pretend, and pretending had been working. I held its attention for maybe 10 seconds. Then I went inside, and I started loading the truck. I left 3 days later. I gave Earl a key to the cabin. I told him I might come back in the spring to clear it out properly, and he nodded, but I think we both knew I wouldn't. I gave him the boat and the motor. I told him to do whatever he wanted with them. I expected him to say he'd sell them or pass them along, but instead he said he'd put them in his shed. And I understood, without him saying anything else, that the boat was not going to be used again. The motor, either. I drove south on a Tuesday morning. I took the dirt road slowly, the way you do when you're leaving a place you might miss. At the end of the road, where it joins the paved county route, I stopped the truck and I looked in the rearview mirror. I could just barely see the lake through the trees. A thin gray line of water, maybe 100 yards of it, between 2 stands of pine. I looked at it for a few seconds. Then I drove on. I want to tell you that the feeling went away after I left. That's not what happened. The feeling got quieter. Earl had been right about that. By the time I'd been in Bangor for a month, the lake was no longer a constant low presence behind everything I did. It had faded into something more like a memory of a sound, or a song you used to know and can't quite hum anymore, but it never went away completely. I notice it sometimes. I'll be sitting in my apartment in Bangor at night, reading, and I'll catch myself breathing in a particular slow rhythm, and I'll know without looking at the clock that it's the rhythm of small waves on a shore. I'll be in the shower, and the sound of the water hitting the tile will arrange itself for a few seconds into a pattern that isn't random. I'll wake up at 3:14 and look at the clock and lie there and not be entirely sure where I am. These are not constant things. They happen maybe once a week, sometimes less. They are easy to ignore if you don't pay attention to them, which is the trick Earl taught me, and which I have gotten reasonably good at. Most days I don't think about Black Hollow at all, but there are things I cannot do anymore. I cannot stand near a body of still water at night. I have tried. There's a small park in Bangor with a duck pond, and I went there last spring on a date with a woman from work, and the sun went down while we were sitting on a bench, and I had to make an excuse and leave. The pond was 20 feet across. There was nothing in it but ducks and algae. I could not stay near it after dark. The woman did not call me again, and I did not blame her. I cannot run a small motor. Lawnmowers are fine. Cars are fine. Anything with an enclosed engine and a muffler is fine. But I helped a friend last summer take a small outboard off a boat trailer, and when he started it up to test it, the sound of it went through me like a cold wire, and I had to sit down. He thought I was having a heart attack. I told him it was something I'd eaten, and I can hear water that isn't there. This is the thing I have not told anyone, and I am telling you now because I think it's the last true thing I have to say about that night. I can hear water that isn't there, not all the time, not every day, but sometimes when the apartment is very quiet and I am very tired and I am about to fall asleep. I can hear the lap of small waves on a shore, and the shore is not in Bangor, and the lake is not anywhere near me, and I know exactly which lake it is, and I know it is hearing me too. Earl told me once that the trick was to live like it isn't there. I have done that, mostly. I have built a small, normal life in a small, normal city, and I have a job I do not hate, and I have a few friends, and I am dating someone now, a different woman, who does not know about Black Hollow and never will. I am, by any external measure, fine, but there is a part of me that did not come back from the lake that night. I want to be clear about what I mean by that. I do not mean that something in me is missing, like a piece that was taken. I mean that something was added and the addition is not separable from me anymore. I do not know what it is. I do not know if it was ever a creature or a will or just a piece of the lake's attention that fastened to me when I broke the rule and never let go. I have stopped trying to work out which. Earl said the people who knew were 100 years dead, and I believe him. What I can tell you is this. If you are ever near a small lake in the woods, and an old man tells you not to do something on it, do not do that thing. He may not know why the rule exists. The rule may sound foolish to you. The rule may sound like superstition or local color, or the kind of thing people repeat because their grandparents repeated it. Follow it anyway. The cost of following it is nothing. The cost of breaking it is something I am still paying more than 2 years later, and will probably keep paying for the rest of my life. I sold the cabin last spring. I never went back to clear it out. Earl handled it for me. He sent me a check for what it sold for, minus what he was owed for his trouble, and I did not ask who bought it. I do not want to know. I hope they are someone local. I hope they were born on the lake the way Earl was. I hope the lake already knows them and does not need to learn them. But sometimes, late at night, in my apartment in Bangor, when the rhythm of my breathing falls into the rhythm of waves I cannot see, I think about whoever is in that cabin now, and I think about the small aluminum boat sitting in Earl's shed, and I think about the porch light I used to leave on, and I wonder if it is on tonight, and who turned it on, and then I make myself stop thinking about it.